Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful sunny day. Um, we are really excited to share the 10-year plan to reduce poverty and inequality with you today. This is a draft plan. We did a soft launch of this just before, in the last week of February, just before COVID took hold in Washington State and everything shut down. This has been a joint effort between the Department of Social and Health Services and Department of Commerce and Employment Security Department. And, you know, little did we know when we embarked on this work 2 years ago that we would find ourselves in the current moment and in a place where experiencing a significant economic downturn where, you know, the strategies and recommendations in this plan would be even more relevant than before. So, you know, we feel, I'm thankful that we had already done significant amount of work on this prior to COVID. But now what we really want to do is hear from folks about this draft, especially in light of everything that's been happening in our state. And we want to hear from you about, you know, what do you like, what's missing, what could be strengthened, what should be emphasized in the wake of the last 3 months. Or maybe it's almost 4 months now. We will incorporate that feedback, and this plan, the official launch of the plan, will be this fall. So we're going to spend some time just going through really a good amount of the process, you know, in the way that we came up with the strategies and recommendations. We are incredibly thankful to have several of our steering committee members that are with us today. Juanita Maestas is joining and co-presenting with me on the call. We also have Alina Swart, who is from Clarkston. Juanita is from Juanita, Maple Valley, correct?
Covington.
Covington, thank you. Alina Swart from Clarkston, Washington, and Amy Rourke from Clark County. And are there any other steering committee members that are on the call? Okay, so hearing none. If you are, send Lindsay or Lindy a chat. If you have comments or questions, you know, we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so going through the plan, and Juanita and I are going to go back and forth. If you have comments or questions, put them in the chat. Lindy and Lindsay are moderating, and we're planning on leaving time at the end, and we really do want to hear from you. So don't be shy, even though this, you know, we were hoping to do these in person. Obviously, that's not happening, but we do hope to be able to meet with folks in person around this this summer, you know, if things move in the right direction. So thank you again for being here.
To augment what Lori just said, if you are shy about writing any questions, feel free to send me a private message, Lindsay Morgan Tracy or Lindy Henry, and we can make sure that it is anonymous and we can still ask it at the end of this presentation.
Thanks,
Thank you, Lori.
Okay. Well, first, a little bit of background. So Governor Inslee formed the Poverty Reduction Work Group back in November of 2017. The governor has been a great champion of this work. You know, he does care deeply about reducing poverty and social and economic mobility in Washington State. These groups, the work is, as I said, is co-led by DSHS, Commerce, and Employment Security Department. And it was a tremendous effort. We met over the course of 2 years, every month, and worked with our steering committee throughout that time to craft the recommendations that we'll be going over today. You know, there's a lot of reasons that we should care about reducing poverty and inequality, the research here is very much on our side, both from a well-being standpoint and a return on investment standpoint. So, you know, I'm a social scientist. There is really, no more robust finding in the social sciences than the effects of poverty and inequality on child, adult, family, and community well-being. If we were to reduce poverty and inequality, all of the indicators that are on the left side of your screen would improve, and this is just a handful. When people have their basic needs met, they do not experience the negative effects associated with poverty. This is a causal relationship. A definitive study came out last year from the National Academy of Sciences. These are not correlations. This is a causal effect. So from just a well-being standpoint, this is an important thing to do because it affects individual and our collective well-being as a state. There's also a large return on investment. So for every dollar invested in reducing child poverty, there's a $7 return to the economy. And that's because we end up spending less on many of the crises that we're dealing with now, like homelessness or the behavioral health crisis, having a high number of people involved with the child welfare, juvenile justice, or criminal justice system. And kids who have their basic needs met tend to, be more engaged in school, and they tend to go on and earn more when they get older. So, from both a well-being and a return on investment perspective, it just makes sense to do this. So the governor, was very much swayed by, I think, the research. And in his directive, he was somewhat prescriptive about who he wanted at this work group or who he wanted at the table. But there was significant flexibility on how we chose to do this work. So, the governor asked that state agencies be at the table. There are 10 state agencies represented. He wanted the state racial and ethnic commissions at the table, legislators from both parties and both the House and the Senate were at the table. And we also had a very large representation from organizations within the community, and that included tribal and urban Indians, employers, community-based organizations, advocacy groups, think tanks, and also philanthropy was represented. Early on in the process, very early on, the group decided that given the racial disproportionality and the experience of poverty, they wanted to focus on racial equity and emphasize it, and really equity in all forms. And I'll go over some of the data in a little bit on what, how equity matters for poverty. So we were very fortunate to have some funding to hire a racial equity consultant that worked with us throughout the development of the strategies and recommendations. So she was with us for well over a year. And we also really prioritized putting the people who were most affected by poverty in the driver's seat. So we created a steering committee made up of 22 people from all over the state. They are an incredible group. We worked with Statewide Poverty Action Network, who is a key partner in this effort, and they staffed the steering committee. This is a group of people who have recent experience or are experiencing poverty and a lot of the issues related to it. They are in various programs with the state and truly know those programs, I would say, better than most people from a global standpoint. So for me and DSHS, for example, I may know our programs really well, but the interconnectedness to our programs with, say, Commerce or Employment Security or Department of Corrections and how they intersect, the steering committee has, they know those systems, they know the integration of those systems, they know the cracks in those systems because they've fallen through them. and they're truly the best people to be working in this space with, so we can improve our service delivery and improve our policies. So I can't say enough about them. And the way that we went about this work, while it was not perfect by any stretch, we all learned a lot along the way. I do want to uplift the model of including people who are most affected as we take on an issue that is just so significant and matters so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Juanita to talk about the experience of the steering committee um, and her colleagues.
Well, good morning, everybody. And this is Juanita. And I don't know where to start. Building the steering committee was really awesome. In my perspective, I get to meet a lot of cool people and hang out with cool people, and I felt like that's where I belong because everybody was going through different things and I can relate to them from one point or another. Um, After we got settled in and stuff, we started working with the bigger work group. And I believe that was a challenge from both sides. From our side, from the steering committee, our biggest thing was, is this real? Are these people going to listen to us? Are they going to represent us? Are they going to be there and take notes? There was everybody was talking about trust, and trust is a big word for us. You know, you have to be able to, we want to trust people to work with us. And with that, we got Lori. Lori came to the meeting and she was bombarded. Um, we, a lot of us didn't have the trust there. We didn't know whether to believe it or not. So she kept coming to meetings and we opened up to her and she opened up to us. And, you know, she was our bridge between the bigger work group and us. And we worked together really hard to get stuff put on paper. But for us, it was a big challenge from both sides. And my colleagues and I, you know, we appreciate everything that's happening right now. We believe that um, we're just amazed with everything and people listening to us. It's not over. Um, because us going through this, we've always heard, oh, we got a solution for this. But, you know, one solution does not take care of all the problems that are out there. And Lori and the bigger work group heard our stories and realized that it's deeper than what people think and what people know. Um, I'm excited to move forward with this, and sorry, I'm kind of short on words today. I'm just amazed with everything, and we, you know, I don't know what to say. I'm lost right now, but I appreciate Lori for being that superwoman that comes in and we can work with this. What do we bring in here? You know, she was great for us. And to this day, we still work together and trying to build that bridge between the communities and let them know that, hey, you know, look what's coming up. And I waited 20 years for something like this to happen. And it's amazing. I don't know what else to say about it. And I'm
Thank
going
you.
to leave that before I start crying.
Thank you, Juanita. I mean, Juanita is being incredibly kind, to us. It was really, um, hard, I think, when people feel like you know, the system is set up to not help them. The steering committee talked about, you know, the various, the patchwork of public assistance programs designed to help people as a game of chutes and ladders. You know, that it was there to manage their poverty, not help them get out of their poverty. Um, you know, is when they feel like they get to a point and then they fall right back down because there's a gap in the system or a you know, contradiction in the system. Um, you know, people said it was like, you know, success was like a lucky roll of the dice. And that's not really the system that we, you know, that we, it's not a system that we want in Washington. I think everybody that works in this field, um, you know, the system really undermines all of us, the federal and the state authorizing environment. And so we were really looking to do something that would be more effective, that would support our workers better, you know, give them the tools that they needed. Many of them came to this work to make a big difference, and also to, you know, really, um, you know, engage meaningfully with the people that we serve. So, you know, Juanita's comments about trust, it took a long time, and we met for 2 years, and we needed that amount of time. We probably could have used more, but it was a very intentional effort to really try to become, you know, strong colleagues in this work. And I want to say we have, in addition to Juanita, Amy, and Alina, we have another steering committee member who joined. So hello, Charisse. Thank you for being on the call today. Okay, so we're going to dive in a little bit to how we thought about poverty going into this work and show some of the data. And as we're going through this, you know, this is pre-COVID. We know from some new projections around poverty that poverty is expected to be the highest it has been in the 50 years of poverty data collection. It's a significant time. The stimulus funding from the federal government has helped curb, I think, you know, economic hardship. That is, a lot of that assistance is going to be ending next month. So, you know, this is as we all know, just a significant time. And it was significant even before COVID. So, but just keep in mind the data I'm about to show is prior to that. So when we thought about, you know, what poverty is and what does it mean to not be in poverty, the group and the steering committee really challenged us to think outside of traditional measures of just economic success. You know, that is, of course, part of it. You know, having your most basic needs met is foundational to our well-being. But it's also not enough. That equally important is having a sense of power and autonomy over your life and a sense of control over your own destiny. And also the feeling of just being valued. You know, we stigmatize and have for so long people experiencing poverty. And, you know, being valued speaks to, you know, feeling of belonging and having dignity. And it's really at a minimum of those three things. And also the group pushed us to think about, you know, what prosperity means, and that what prosperity means can look different to different communities, to people of different, you know, backgrounds. And as we think about poverty, we need to allow for those different definitions. Now, we don't always have data to speak to all of those different aspects of poverty. So I'm going to focus on the data that we do have, which largely is a comment on the economic part of poverty. And just know that the conversation around how we better measure, you know, this picture is something we're talking about. And, you know, we rely on qualitative data a fair amount to tell that story. But for the economic data, we use 200% of the official poverty measure. That's about $43,000 a year for a family of three, to look at economic hardship. We use 200% of the federal poverty measure because that is the bare minimum that people really in almost every community across the country, and certainly in Washington state, needs to meet their most basic needs. And in most places in Washington, it falls far short of meeting their most basic needs. So pre-COVID, that was 25% of Washingtonians, 1.8 million people, including 500,000 children. But we also know the official measure of poverty hides quite a bit. And so new measures have emerged in the last 2 decades. The official measure has been around since 1963. But new measures have emerged that really look at, well, what does it take to make basic needs, at the community level? So, a person living in Clark County, it's a different cost of living there than, say, Spokane or King County or up in Whatcom or on the coast. And so cost of living measures really try to break that down. And they factor in more than just, what the official poverty measure looks at and accounts for things like childcare, cost of transportation, cost of technology like internet, etc. So if you look at one of those measures, 43% of households are falling below the threshold of where they're able to meet their most basic needs in Washington state. And then finally, we have intergenerational poverty measures that are really recent. And there's not a set intergenerational poverty measure. There's some experimentation, but one such measure looks at the number of adults that received public assistance as a child. And in Washington state, 46% of adults on food assistance received food assistance as a child, which shows the intergenerational nature of poverty and also the efficacy of programs to lift people out of poverty. So, it's using these different measures together starts to paint a more robust picture, but it's definitely not the full picture. The burden of poverty is not experienced equally anywhere in the country, and certainly not in Washington state. I don't have a map of Washington. If I did, you would see that rural communities experience the highest burden of poverty throughout the state. Many of them did not recover even from the last recession. And increasingly, suburban areas are experiencing poverty. Because cities have become so expensive to live in that a lot of people who were lower income are being forced out into suburban areas of the state. So it's a trend called the suburbanization of poverty. And if we start to look at breakdowns by race and ethnicity, sex, immigration, age, disability, you can see that the burden is not shared equally. Indigenous, Black, and Brown Washingtonians have the highest rates of poverty. These disparities are widening in the current downturn. Women, especially women who are heading families on their own, and if their children are young, immigrants and refugees, especially those who are yet to obtain citizenship. Naturalization is so important for the economic security of immigrants and refugees. Youth age 18 to 24 and under the age of 5 have the highest poverty rates of any age group. And of course, those are just, pivotal times in development for children. And then people with disabilities have very high rates compared to the state average. There's significant variation across different racial and ethnic groups. There's also a lot of variation within racial and ethnic groups. And this just points to the need to tell a better story. Our data systems are limited. They tell a story. We try to use different information to, tell the best story we can. But even with that, we often overlook the details within the data to dig deeper. So if we were to break down data for the Asian and Pacific Islander category, for example, While they overall, as a racial ethnic group, have a low poverty rate, it masks considerable variation, within the Asian and Pacific Islander community. Same goes for the Latino community. We've broken data down here for different tribal nations. And we need to pay attention to this because we can't just paint one picture of what poverty is like for any one particular group or any one particular region. And there is, momentum and a general movement. And I would say Abigail Echohawk, who is the Chief Research Officer for Seattle Indian Health Board, she's really, one of the lead thought leaders in this space around decolonizing data and stories. What she says, and this she's speaking from the indigenous perspective, but this is true really of any racial and ethnic group, that when we think about data, it was never gathered to help or serve us. It was primarily done to show the deficits in our communities, to show where there are gaps. And it's always done from a deficit-based framework. What they don't talk about is the strengths of our community, and decolonizing data is about controlling our own story and making decisions based on what is best for our people. So I think this is a practice that, we are really encouraging throughout agencies and state government to let people represented in the data tell their own story because those gaps exist, and really, let them be the ones to convey not just like what's happening, but also weigh in on the solutions. So all of this has significant and serious consequences, not just for the people who are experiencing poverty, but as a collective for the state. Indigenous, Black, and Brown Washingtonians' incomes are 1/3 lower than the state average. And if we were to eliminate those gaps in Washington state, our GDP would grow by $38 billion annually. And that's just eliminating the racial gaps. If we were to look at all the other demographic gaps by, rural, urban, or by sex or immigration, et cetera, our GDP would grow even further. So eliminating poverty, again, has, not just a well-being component, but also, when everyone is doing better, truly our state collectively would do better. So as we went through this process, over 2 years, the steering committee met monthly. We as a full group met monthly. The steering committee had 2 co-chairs. Juanita was one of them. The other was Drayton Jackson, and they attended both of those meetings. The steering committee had experts come in. They really worked on, what they would prioritize. The full work group had experts coming in. We went back and forth. And over the course of 2 years, over 250 recommendations surfaced as to what needed to happen. So it was a very organic effort. We didn't try to control it, but we did realize toward the end that, we really needed to put an organizational framework around these recommendations and organize them in thematic ways so that people could, see themselves in the work. So we came up with some guiding principles and criteria. And I'm going to go over this, and then I'm going to give Juanita a chance to talk about what this looked like from the perspective of the steering committee. So the first principle and criteria we used was addressing root causes and the urgency of now. The group focused a lot on, why is it that we haven't been successful at reducing poverty when clearly so many people are working on this issue? And they emphasize the fact that we haven't really focused on the root causes of poverty. And so we wanted to create the systemic change that was going to make meaningful and measurable reductions in poverty rates. But that said, and the steering committee was 100% on board with that, but they also kind of brought us down to earth and said, that's great. And yes, we should focus on systemic change, but I'm having a difficult time feeding my family today, and I may not make rent this month. And so the urgency of the moment was something that we needed to pay attention to. So we had to, make recommendations that would make the most of the system we have to address the urgency of now, and also try to build a system that really gets at those root causes. We, of course, elevated the expertise and influence of people experiencing poverty. The steering committee for this work had the authority to prioritize the recommendations. They also had final approval over our plan. So if we didn't get things right as we went back and forth, they sent it back to us and said, you didn't do enough here, you're missing this, you need to do more. And so there was a lot of back and forth between our two groups, but the steering committee ultimately had the final approval for what we did. We focused on achieving equity in all forms for all those groups we mentioned earlier, but we emphasized racial equity because it is foundational to achieving equity in every other way. We blended evidence, innovation, and collaboration. There's no shortage of great things happening throughout the country that we can learn from, and also from other countries. There's no shortage of good ideas. There's tons of pilots. There's a lot of stuff that we could implement that would do a lot of good. So we pulled from that quite a bit. But even with that evidence, we know that it hasn't made a full dent in poverty reduction. And a lot of the evidence that exists has not meaningfully closed the disproportionality for different groups experiencing poverty. So that burden that we discussed earlier. So we did allow for a fair amount of innovation in our efforts, and that innovation really was guided by the steering committee and people most affected. And then we also we didn't feel like we needed to recreate the wheel when there were great efforts happening alongside us. So we pulled from numerous efforts that were in existence to align our work with theirs and build upon some of the great work that's already been done. And then finally, so many of our systems instill fear in people, especially when you're talking about people experiencing poverty. And we know from the emerging science of hope that hope is so critical for people to, be upwardly mobile out of poverty and stop an intergenerational cycle of poverty. So we also know when people have their basic needs met, they're incredibly resilient, and so are children. So we wanted to put together a plan that inspired hope and built on the, resilience that people have. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Juanita and give her a chance to talk about what this process looked like in the steering committee.
Hello again. I think for the steering committee, it was crazy on both sides. I mean, in everything that you do, you have the people that are like, yay, and you got people that are like, nay. It was intense, really, really intense. And we get through a cycle and then, bring it to the bigger work group and here's what we need. And then they're like, here's what we can do. And it was just a lot of back and forth, and a lot of effort with both sides and making this possible for everybody. And I loved the ending of it because we finally got to a place where we're just like, this is what we like. This is what we wanted to see. Let's push it forward. And, the greatest thing for me was knowing that we got all these people in the bigger work group pushing us and standing behind us and saying, okay, we're going to stand with these guys. We're going to make it better. I mean, but it was intense. And then we had the good times. We had the times where we're just like, hey, let's take a break, go out. And we actually had like dinner with some of the steering committee and the bigger work group. Um, but all in all, it's a plan that, you know, we put in place and want to move forward. So if anybody says it was easy, it was not easy for anybody. And, you know, I I love the bigger work group for taking time to listen to us and putting stuff in motion, and appreciate Lori. She's like the go-getter. You know, she heard it from both sides, and this woman is like amazing. And everybody else that is involved, the steering committee, you know, we pushed forward. We did not back down, and you know, it was just incredible. Incredible. I'm very honored to be on both sides of this adventure that we're pushing forward with.
Thank you, Juanita. I think, you know, Juanita talking about how difficult it was, I concur. It was so much work of so many people, especially the steering committee. And you know, this is emotional stuff. It was hard, and we didn't always agree. There was a lot of stuff in between our meetings, and
No.
oh, can we mute Kim, Lindy, by any chance? I think we've had a child takeover of somebody's account, it looks like.
Lori, I'm not able to.
You're not able to. Okay. So there we go. Okay. Thank you, Kim. It has happened to all of us. So, you know, we had to remind ourselves at some point that if this were easy, we wouldn't be doing it right. And so just very much appreciated the pushback. And I think all of us, you know, really had to abandon a lot of the assumptions we had and go into this with a beginner's mind to create a plan that was going to, you know, shake up the status quo. So Juanita is absolutely right that it was extraordinary process, and we're deeply grateful. Okay, so with all that in mind, you know, we were able to narrow this down into 8 strategies with 56 specific recommendations that we would like your feedback on. So, you know, I don't have time to go through all 56 recommendations in detail. We do really encourage you to go to the plan if you want the specifics, as well as, like, you know, the backup, a lot of the evidence that we used. But I'm going to highlight, you know, as much as I can over the next 15 minutes or so before we turn it to questions. So be thinking about you know, what might be missing here or what you might elevate in the wake of COVID. So strategy number 1 was to understand structural racism and historical trauma and take action to undo their harmful effects in state policy programs and practice. I think more people now in the wake of the George Floyd murder understand this in a way that they didn't before, and certainly momentum to take on structural racism is a conversation happening every single day now in our agency at DSHS and other state agencies, and I'm sure many of the organizations that you're in as well. If we don't work on this, we would not make meaningful progress on poverty. The second strategy is to make equal space for the power and influence of people and communities most affected in decision making. This is really a testament to the role that the steering committee played in this process. We feel like this plan is strong, and I guarantee you that these strategies would not be what they are if it wasn't for the role of the steering committee and the pushback that they played in the process. So they were essential colleagues, and we would like to see that throughout state government. Target equitable education, income growth, and wealth building opportunities for people with low incomes. Of course, those are, you know, important. Strengthening health supports across the lifespan to promote the intergenerational well-being of families. addressing the urgent needs of people experiencing homelessness, violence, mental illness, and or addiction. These issues really are the four main issues that prevent somebody from getting on a educational or career pathway, or getting the support that they need to move out of poverty. Build an integrated human service continuum of care that addresses the holistic needs of children, adults, and families. This is something the steering committee spent a lot of time on, was the contradictions in our systems, the fact that we spread public assistance across 7 or 8 agencies in Washington state, and navigating all those systems and the contradictions. Decriminalizing poverty and reducing reliance on the child welfare, juvenile justice, and criminal justice systems. We know these systems exacerbate the experience of poverty everywhere in the country and in Washington state. And then finally, ensuring a just and equitable transition to the future of work. The future of work, we were already experiencing disruption, especially to work that pays lower wages, with advancements in automation and artificial intelligence. In the wake of the downturn that we're experiencing now, the future of work really accelerated by about 1,000%. So, in this moment, how we prepare for building back is a conversation that is very much happening and on people's minds right now. So I'll go through these again relatively quickly. I'm sorry, it's like there's a lot and it's really dense, so bear with me here. But for strategy number 1, there's a emerging Office of Equity in Washington state. This is an office that exists and was funded by Governor Inslee in the last budget, but he, in the wake of the downturn, he had to downsize our state budget. And so while the Office of Equity exists, it does not have funding, but they are doing a lot of work to address equity, especially as we move toward economic recovery. But we really encourage working with that office to develop trainings on trauma, structural racism, implicit bias, and really develop the data processes and tools that would prioritize and advance racial equity across programs in state government. And each agency is in different stages of this journey toward doing their work in a way that would achieve equity. So work is being done, but a more I'd say intentional effort is needed if we're actually going to achieve equity in all forms, but especially racial equity. Strategy number 2, making equal space for people most affected. We really do want the steering committee to be an institutionalized practice in every agency, and are advocating for that right now. Developing a process for truth and reconciliation was something that came up. That conversation started, with our Indigenous partners on the group, but it extended to Black and Brown Washingtonians in general, all of which have a different story as it relates to the need for truth and reconciliation. And then increasing the ownership of communities, the ownership capacity and capital in communities most affected, so that they can build wealth in their own community, is another strategy or recommendation. The third strategy around education, income growth, and wealth building. A lot of work has been done in this space. We pulled from the Washington Roundtable in Washington state, that was redundant. The Washington Roundtable put out a Washington Kids for Washington Jobs report, which had a lot of great recommendations in it. So we recommended adopting those, but also that report acknowledged that equity was important, but didn't go quite far enough. And so we included a lot of the recommendations that came up in our group to bolster theirs. Accelerating naturalization, eliminating harsh discipline practices in schools, which disproportionately affect Indigenous, Black, and Brown children. Increasing the availability of affordable childcare and housing for student parents. There's numerous recommendations in here that would really go a long way. Enforcing salary and wage transparency and fair labor practices is super important to eliminate disparities in income along demographic lines. Expanding access to no or low cost financial resources and education. You know, getting banked, for example, is a critical recommendation. Avoiding predatory lending, and just having access to capital so that you can better manage your finances. And there's a lot of great work happening, especially within credit unions in Washington State on those issues. Tax policy has a key role to play in this. We tax low-income people more than any other state in the country. So lowering the effective tax rate and enacting changes that support equitable economic growth so more people can benefit from the growth in the economy. Modernizing unions. There's a child care collaborative task force that's been working. They have many of their own recommendations for improving child care, and we recommended adopting those. And then increasing and preserving affordable housing in Washington State. Strategy 4, health supports to promote intergenerational well-being. We have a great Apple Health program in Washington. It's one of the best public health insurance programs in the country. We have the lowest rate of uninsurance in the country. And so we could build off that program and provide a supplemental benefit that would help with out-of-pocket medical costs, which are a big expense for people experiencing poverty. Culturally and linguistically appropriate healthcare, you know, especially before, during, and after pregnancy, but for, you know, families of all shapes and sizes, reproductive care, nutritional programs, and for seniors, using Medicaid funds to provide in-home support so that they don't have to receive care outside of their home and they're able to stay in their home. These are all things that would help with health supports that would reduce poverty across the lifespan. Strategy 5, these, you know, 4 issues that are so critical to overcome to actually get on a path out of poverty. Community-led data collection is really critical here. These issues look different in every community, and we need to understand that nuance to implement community-level solutions. Rental assistance and diversion, increasing emergency, transitional, and permanent supportive housing options. We are in a severe shortage of those programs to meet the need. Supported education and job training and employment. If people are experiencing, say, behavioral health, you know, issue, and they have a hard time being at work, but you support them with what they need to remain in that space, we have a wonderful program in Employment Security Department that was piloted, and we could scale that program, but we would need to fund it. It's a great example of a place where we have really good solutions, but we need the political will to implement them. A medical financial partnership. This is something where you really blend, you know, healthcare with social services to give people the wraparound services that they need. And expanding behavioral health, increasing access to that, especially across our education system. Those are all things that were emphasized. Building a better continuum of care. Again, this is something the steering committee just helped us so much on in understanding, you know, how the system works right now and the gaps. You know, as I said, it was described as a system like a game of chutes and ladders, that it wasn't really there to help people. And that's not a system that we want. We want a system that's really going to empower people and give them hope and build on their resilience. So having a shared set of outcomes across the agencies that administer public benefits, and holding them accountable to those outcomes, updating the standard of need, which is very low in Washington State, but updating a standard of need so that it reflects actual cost of living and tying assistance to that so foundational needs can be met. Developing a universal intake system. People have said that they've had to share their story 20 times because they're dealing with so many different systems, and it's just exhausting. And it's traumatizing to share your story over and over and over again. So building a better platform, shared platform. Increasing cash assistance. Most assistance people receive is, directly for food, or they get rental assistance. Making cash assistance more readily available and unconditional upon work. The research is very strong on this. People need additional cash assistance to buy things like school supplies or just personal hygiene items. Basic needs is more than just food and housing. Certainly those are probably two of the most important. But having some cash assistance so you can have flexibility in how you spend it to meet the needs of your family is really important. And research shows that unconditional cash assistance is more effective and is not a disincentive for work. People actually use that money to attend higher education, to do job training, and to improve their career opportunities. So again, the research is very strong on this, and we could be doing more of it, especially right now. Smoothing on ramps and off ramps for programs. It can be hard to get on, and there's cliff effects, because of the contradictions across our programs, and more easily ramping people off until they're economically stable. And then again, inspiring hope and building off people's resilience. Strategy 7, decriminalizing poverty. This is something you're hearing about quite a bit right now, and reducing reliance on child welfare, juvenile justice, and criminal justice. Shifting resources toward diversion treatment and support and away from these systems. Again, we were doing this work before COVID, before the murder of George Floyd. This is a conversation very much happening right now. That people who are experiencing poverty, they need resources, and if they are criminalized by the system, it just exacerbates the experience of poverty for them and their families and makes it that much harder to get out. When if they had appropriate resources ahead of time, it would divert them from those systems. Rapidly engaging families, providing robust trauma-informed case management, expanding employment opportunities, giving people a second chance, safe, culturally responsive homes, and just better coordinated exit and reentry. This was also a huge category for the steering committee in the way that it was affecting their lives. So we spent a lot of time working through this. And then finally, strategy 8, ensure a just and equitable transition to the future of work. This was another example where great work was happening, and we pulled from a task force that was aligned with us, the Future of Work Task Force. We recommended adopting those recommendations, but again, bolstering them with some very specific recommendations meant to eliminate the gaps in poverty. Tax system has a big role to play here as well, incentivizing employers for, providing living wage employment. Developing an economic trigger in our budgeting to provide counter-cyclical funding. We didn't know we would be in the current downturn. We could better prepare for downturns if we used economic triggers that turned on funding when people needed it the most, like right now. And then finally, developing a pilot for portable benefits and a guaranteed basic income program. This was something we recommended piloting in preparation for the future of work. It was a longer term recommendation. This is getting more and more attention in the wake of the current downturn. So lots of recommendations, and there's a lot more detail to each of them. So as we thought about, how would we go about implementing this? And again, this was pre-COVID, and our thinking has changed a bit. But, really, in this first year, we wanted to lay a strong foundation for this work. And, you know, that included getting a lot of feedback from community to make sure that we get this right. Again, we're doing a official launch of this in the fall after Labor Day. And this year we've been doing a ton of groundwork just to set the stage for the next 10 years. And over the next 10 years, we really wanted to maximize the system that we have. There's certainly improvements we could be doing now, and that speaks to the steering committee really pushing us to address the urgency of now while we're building the system we need alongside that. I would say in the wake of COVID, what we saw is the system maximized, maybe not to the full extent, but to an extraordinary extent. And even with that, the gaps are still huge. And so, you know, we've been saying we really can't wait 10 years to build the system we need. The time is now. And there's a lot of efforts underway to try to accelerate our work on building the system we need. There's a lot of efforts that are speaking to the plan in the wake of the current downturn. You know, we want to create a definition of economic recovery that moves beyond traditional measures of what recovery means, which are largely focused on aggregate unemployment or expansion of GDP. We're trying to push the state to adopt a definition of recovery that is based on low unemployment, low poverty, and no racial or geographic inequality. A lot of groups did not recover from the last recession. In some parts of the state and rural communities, unemployment exceeded 10%. So, you know, addressing these issues and building toward a different future, now is the time to do that. Of course, inviting people experiencing intergenerational poverty to these tables as we're making decisions. We've pulled steering committee members in various ways to make sure that their voice is there and their expertise is included. We've worked with our state partners and the governor's office to really emphasize what's needed right now. Immediate investments really need to provide and give people the peace of mind that their foundational needs are going to be met when there are not jobs available. And then near-term investments could go further to provide cost of living supports for things like childcare, unconditional cash assistance, employment and trading opportunities to shift to that future of work. All of those things should be happening very quickly. And then over the long term, we really are positioning this as the 10-year plan as a foundation for equitable recovery. And just last month, the secretary co-leads of this effort and Governor Inslee's cabinet endorsed this plan along with 7 other agencies requesting that this plan be a foundation for equitable recovery. So that was a lot of information. Before I turn it over to Juanita for the final word, I want to share the statement that she and her colleague Drayton Jackson wrote as we were submitting this to Governor Inslee on behalf of the steering committee, which, as Juanita indicated earlier, really had a hard time in this process, trusting that their work would, you know, lead up to something, that it would not be in vain. And so this is what is on the front page of the site. I'm sorry, on the plan. Trust is something that comes hard for many of us, and a plan without action is just a plan. We wholeheartedly want to believe that the time and energy we invested in this effort will result in the policy and program changes so desperately needed for our children, families, and communities, but remain concerned that politics and privilege will trump the bold steps needed for more Washingtonians to achieve the independence, self-determination, and economic success that can be shared with our children and grandchildren. We are deeply grateful to Governor Inslee for taking a stand on poverty and inequality. For those of you with the power to now decide whether and how to act, please remember that millions of Washingtonians, just like us, will continue to struggle to keep a roof over our head, struggle to feed our children, and live without peace of mind that things will be okay please don't forget that we are the people behind the numbers, the lives that will benefit should you choose to act. You know, this was true for 1.8 million people before COVID. Again, 500,000 of them children. And now we know that many, many more have joined them. So how we show up in this moment is critical to the well-being of our state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Juanita for the final word before we take questions.
There's a couple of things with this that, you know, I have to shout out to the steering committee for making a strong push forward and making things possible and trusting the bigger work group to help make this to where it's at now. And to the bigger group for trusting in us and believing that this is not a story that is not true, and that a lot of us are going through this now. And being on these webinar meetings is just amazing of the outcome of people that are interested and want to learn more about how these two amazing groups got together and put this in place to make a change and to understand what is going on with everything right now. And, you know, we will still continue to work together and stay in touch and do everything that we can to make this the #1 priority for us, and especially with the COVID, you know, I don't know what else to say, but, you know, we've always wanted to build a village, and with doing that, you grab everybody from the different organizations, different communities, and pull together and make us strong for Washington. I just appreciate everybody that is involved with this, and know that, you know, we're here. So with that, thank you, Lori, Lindsay. You know, you can't forget Lindsay. She's like our guru lady, you know, make things happen also. Lori, you know, the work you put into this. So everybody that's listening to this, you know, please take a step forward and help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Juanita. And we also have another steering committee member that joined, Victoria. So Victoria, thank you for being on the line. And Amy is putting the site up, dismantlepovertyinwashington.com. Thank you, Amy. We'll go to this slide toward the end. And you know, now we have some questions really, you know, that can guide the discussion. You know, this is really your turn to provide feedback on, you know, what are your reactions? I see a lot of people have provided some feedback already, and I'm going to rely on Lindsay and Lindy to maybe summarize that a little bit. And also, what questions do you have, or what do you have to contribute? We really want this to be the strongest it can be. We feel very fortunate we did this amount of work prior to the current moment, and we want to take advantage of this great work going into the fall, and lots of decisions that are going to be made that will affect this issue. So would love to hear from you.
Lori, we received a question early in the presentation from Bridget, who's a community planner for a small city, population of 1,200. She says, our economy is very dependent on the service industry, but many employees can't afford to live here. We continue to work on reducing barriers to facilitate the building of more housing, but it's not enough. What can a small city do to help implement these recommendations?
Thank you. That's a great question. And actually, we received a similar question on a previous, on a previous webinar. So we are incredibly fortunate to have our new colleague, Megan, who is on the call. Megan is our engagement manager, and she just started this week. And so one of the things that we're working on with the official launch of the plan is to develop tools for communities to and action plans, and as well as some data to really guide how smaller communities and bigger communities could implement this plan at their level. So we should have like a toolkit coming out this fall, so keep an eye out for that. And you know, you're talking about housing. You know better than I that, you know, providing affordable housing is a collaboration, you know, with the state, but really happens at the local level, and with counties. So, you know, our partners in commerce are working on recommendations in this plan, and how they're going to take action on them. So certainly more to come, but we will be in touch, you know, with folks who've participated in these webinars with those toolkits as they become available.
Great. And then Lauren asked, what will the pilot for universal basic income look like?
Oh, good question. So, you know, at this point, these are recommendations. There is some implementation happening around several of these recommendations, and we're getting a lot of questions around how do we move to action. And again, I want to say that the steering committee is pushing us really hard on this because they did not want this plan to just sit around. So the guaranteed basic income pilot is an interesting one. You know, people definitely saw that as something like, that sounds like a good thing to figure out, but didn't see it happening immediately. So we don't exactly know what the pilot is going to look like. I think what's happening now is the state and you know, funders, the philanthropic community, there is some interest generating. Last year, Senator Wynn introduced a bill recommending a pilot. State agencies are looking into how this might happen, and then the philanthropic community is looking at different pilots that they might want to fund. It could happen a lot of different ways. There are pilots around the country that we reference in the plan. They're all a little different, and so how we do it here is yet to be determined, but we're seeing more interest in the issue.
Great. And another question from Victor at Department of Health. Does DSHS or the state seek to recoup costs for social benefits from fathers whose children were enrolled in benefits? Did the work group discuss or consider the impact this government practice was having on low-income men? And he clarified whether this practice continues and was it discussed?
Yes. So I believe that Victor is referencing, so a lot of fathers who, well, I don't know for sure, but if you are a non-custodial parent, a lot of the child support, first of all, our systems don't generally acknowledge the role of fathers in children's lives. There is an increasing movement nationally around fatherhood, and really making sure that you know, children and their fathers, that we have supports in place so those relationships are nurtured, you know, from a financial standpoint, but really from a social and emotional standpoint. Fathers play a critical role in their children's lives, and they've been left out of most social support. So I believe that's what Victor is referring to. We have a fatherhood initiative in DSHS that is, you know, building there's a fatherhood council in Washington State, and one of the members of that council was on our steering committee. And I think a lot of the conversation, not just with child support and, you know, social assistance for dads, but also the criminal justice system and mass incarceration and its effects on men, especially men of color. Those were all things that were discussed. But your question is a great one. I think we need to be more explicit in the plan about the role of fathers, and that they systems were not created to support them in the same way as they were created for women. So thank you for that, and we will definitely work on strengthening.
Can I add to that, Lori? This is Megan.
Yes.
So I work for the Division of Child Support for 10 years. We refer to, as Lori was saying, non-custodial parents, or any parent who is not stated as being in the household when the other parent applies for cash assistance. So Victor's question is addressing what happens when one parent who lives with a child, or a relative or whoever, applies for benefits with the child, and one or both parents are not in the house. It automatically triggers a child support case to be opened for the parent or parents who are not in the household. And Washington State historically was created, child support was created to recoup those costs. So that is correct, Victor. In recent years, we've been moving more towards more like a social kind of platform. And I kind of see some of this across all state agencies, but it still has a lot of work to do with not just saying that not just assuming that the non-custodial parent is always the father, because we have a lot of mothers, speaking sex-wise, because our systems haven't caught up to address non-binary parents. But so men and women having children who are not in the household, and they have been doing work to create more right-sized orders, so orders based on the earning potential of the parents. But there is still a lot of work to do in these systems, and there are some laws and bills that are being introduced right now to kind of address some of those issues. What do we do when a parent is incarcerated? Currently, some of those orders could be suspended, but they're still there and enforceable, and part of the debt that an incarcerated parent has to deal with upon release. So I'm glad that this is part of the discussion, because we know that this also has an impact on a person's ability to get out of poverty, that child support obligation. So how do we help families support families, especially when we know that just because a parent isn't living with their child doesn't mean that they're not financially helping that child, buying clothes, spending time with the child, and things like that. So thank you for that question. And thank you, Lori, for letting me interrupt.
Thanks, Megan. That was great.
Lori, another question.
Mm-hmm.
What is something that the committee would recommend philanthropic organizations do today to help relieve the impacts of poverty for Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, neurodivergent, and LGBTQ folks in Washington?
Oh, wow. How much more time do we have? 15 minutes. It's a great question. So I do see the need for a significant public-private investment to happen to build momentum and to take action on this plan. Right now in the economic downturn, government and the philanthropic sector are really the sectors that have the resources to do something. And philanthropy has stepped in to fill the gaps. So like the Washington Food Fund, for example, is a great effort between the state and foundations. So I think, in response to your question, it's a longer conversation. Philanthropic organizations can, begin engaging the very groups that you're mentioning and asking them, what is it that you need right now that you're missing? And if you're not getting it from the state, and the state has already stretched itself as far as possible, how does philanthropy fill that gap? So that's just like my initial thought is, I know every single one of these groups is in tremendous need right now, and that's in spite of an enormous expansion of the safety net, in response to the downturn. So where are the gaps? And then, philanthropy is also uniquely positioned, I think, to work with people most affected and the state to provide the funding that allows us to innovate. Um, you know, we don't have a lot of room with taxpayer money to make innovations. You know, we really spend most of that money on serving people. Um, and, you know, you want to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. And every agency has significant accountability toward that, which prevents us sometimes from making the changes we would like. So how can philanthropy and the state come together to recognize, you know, what the state can push further, but work with philanthropy to do some of the innovation and, you know, build toward scaling that? I think that those are the opportunities that we're looking for. And we have had conversations with philanthropy around the plan, and like, you know, what does the partnership around this look like? So we would love your input as well. But, you know, specifically to each of these groups, this is like, this is the conversation we want to be having over the long term.
Great. And a question for Maria. As a person of color, it seems like equity seems to always depend largely on philanthropy. And from your answer, it seems like this plan will also depend on philanthropy. Did I understand that correctly?
I want to make sure I understood the question, Lindy. So I think the question, is it that doing something on equity is dependent on philanthropy? Is that right? Is that the question?
It seems like equity seems to always depend largely on philanthropy.
Oh, okay. If I gave that impression, I definitely do not want to give that impression. I mean, philanthropy has a significant role to play, but equity is dependent. You know, achieving equity, it matters for all of us. So strategy one in this plan is to undo structural racism and historical trauma throughout our programs. That starts with personal transformation for our employees. Most state agencies, and I'm speaking, you know, on behalf of DSHS, and Megan has been a significant contribution to these efforts. You know, we have to do the personal transformation so that we can do our work in a way that would achieve equity. And that is on each of us, and that's on our state to hold leaders accountable to, you know, embrace all of that in our work. And then beyond that, you know, we can look at contracts, we could look at hiring practices, we can look at using data to recognize disproportionality. Engaging groups like the steering committee is a way that we can achieve equity. So everyone at the state level should be asking themselves how they can do more in this way. And it goes from the personal to the system within state government, and how we partner with entities outside of state government, including philanthropy. So if I gave the impression that it's up to philanthropy, it's not. It's up to all of us.
Could I just, I would love to commend the teams on this incredibly thorough, quantitative and qualitative plan that addresses so much and able to economize on the you know, the amount of pages. And I think it's fantastic. And speaking for Seattle Credit Union, we see ourselves fitting in recommendation 3, but also in myriads of other places as well in the plan. And we can't wait to get started. My question is, as far as rolling out and executing the plan, do you plan on doing it in any specific geographic place first, or how is there going to be stages?
Yeah. Hi, Barney. It's great to see you.
Hey,
I didn't know
Lori.
you were on here. Yeah. So that's a great question in terms of how we do this. You know, I think it was Bridget maybe earlier that asked about, you know, for a small community, like how can we do this? As we move toward the official launch of this plan in the fall, you know, we will have finished this engagement, and it'll be a living document. so it may change over time. I think the idea is for every locality, to really weigh in on, because poverty looks different in every community, the solutions, there's no one size fits all solution. So what we want to do is provide these like toolkits, work with a lot of the groups that are on the ground, like community action partners, for example. The credit unions are throughout Washington state. United Ways are present throughout the state, and community foundations, all those community groups that have deep roots and really understand where they live in a way that we don't. So we want to do the work at the state level by putting out information, but we do need a structure to both partner and allow communities to let us know what they're doing and provide feedback. So we're figuring that out. I mentioned that Megan was just hired, and she's really rounding out the team that's working on this, which is a co-led effort across 3 agencies. So we are spending our whole summer trying to figure out your question, Barney. And if there are models that people know of that work elsewhere, we would love to hear from them. We have some good insight from national partners on what's working in other places, but anything that you know of or recommendations you have to do that well, we would appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm here to help and definitely want to be involved. So please keep me in mind. It's amazing. It's awesome.
Thank you, Barney. I appreciate that. And Seattle Credit Union, I mentioned credit unions earlier. I mean, Seattle Credit Union is one of the banks that's just doing extraordinary work around the role of the financial sector. Lindy?
Sure. So another question was, will the stipulations for being able to qualify for housing be revised? Meaning you can't get a place unless you make 3 times the rent.
Yeah, this came up, this issue came up a lot. There are so many efforts happening around the state to address affordable housing. There's a critical shortage of housing stock. I think that the downturn has, helped with putting a moratorium on evictions, but, revising housing policy, that sits within the purview of the Department of Commerce and the counties. And I know that those conversations are happening right now. We certainly have advocated for that in our plan, that we need to, significantly overhaul access to affordable housing, but also to make sure more affordable housing is there. The emergency response to preventing more homelessness from occurring and also sheltering homeless people during this time to not expose them more to the pandemic. That's really been the focus, I would say, of the beginning. And now it's shifting to your question. So Low Income Housing Alliance, there are great groups working on that issue, and we are, working with them to learn from them and what they recommend.
And a similar question or comment about housing. I feel that housing subsidy is needed, and I have a program in our county that does assist clients who are on SSI and disabled due to mental illness or other medical disabilities. It does work, and I have had these programs for 3 years, and it has kept people housed. Children are safe and not fearful of losing their homes. And that was from someone different than the original question.
Yeah, so is that a question or a comment?
I think it's a comment from Gloria.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria. Yeah, I mean, there are programs that are out there that work. We have in Washington State, we have the Aged Blind or Disabled program, which makes people eligible for housing and essential needs. But in the wake of the Great Recession, programs that supported people who were, unstably housed, they got cut in the last recession. And we dismantled those programs, created new ones, and we still need those programs. I think there's wide recognition now that we cut programs in the last recession at a time when people needed them the most. And it's a significant challenge in this downturn. And a lot of effort needs to be made so that we don't make that same mistake, because we know those decisions exacerbated the homelessness crisis and the behavioral health crisis. So, you know, I mean, lots of people are talking about that, including the governor's office, that, you know, they've made extraordinary investments in homelessness in this state.
And for our last question, sticking with housing, why is most affordable housing centered around renting and not owning?
Yeah, so that was part of, you know, we talked a lot around when we had to address affordable housing, we separated it out in our plan. You know, obviously there's addressing some of the crises, which is providing more of the kinds of housing to address the homelessness crisis, and that's in like strategy 5. And then we also included recommendations that would help people, you know, get to a place where they could eventually own a home. So we did try to emphasize both. You know, owning a home is one of the ways in which people accumulate wealth over their lifetime. So obviously it's a strategy that we should be moving toward. And, you know, I don't have a perfect answer to your question. Barney actually may have a better answer, because he does this work in his community and across the state. But I know that there's efforts underway to provide financial tools so more people can access housing. So Barney, do you want to jump in?
Sure. In our work with the Scale Credit Union, our whole goal, for example, like in an extreme case, is to take someone who is experiencing homelessness and move them along that continuum or spectrum to, you know, from surfing on the couch, let's say, to getting their own apartment from rent, and then helping them through our financial education workshops on how to start to budget, you know, things of that nature. That way we're kind of building, and then helping build credit as well. And so, you know, the main thing is we're meeting our members where they're at, and then we're going from there on that journey. So absolutely, we're trying to move people towards home ownership, because as Lori said, that really is a foundational piece to building wealth and hopefully generational wealth. So you can kind of reverse the cycle that you all highlighted as far as intergenerational poverty. So I think we can do the same. So our biggest roadblock has been really to really kind of to protect our members' assets, and at the same time make these loans that are considered quote unquote high risk. And so I think working with the state and figuring out what those guidelines are, what makes sense, especially if we're doing this type of work, and then being able to put those like a low interest mortgage with backed by the state or something like that, where we can actually start to build on that keystone as far as you know, that wealth piece, I think is definitely doable, especially utilizing the 10-year plan here, because poverty is not easy, and it's just taking a multitude of different agencies figuring it out, instead of building, working all in silos, as well as nonprofits and for-profits, et cetera. So to have all this together, I think is going to be huge, and I think it's a step in the right direction. And as I mentioned before, we're really committed to this, even prior to learning about this, and the fact that we know that we're going to be backed by like Lori and Lindsay and the governor. I think it's going to be, you know, it charges us up even more. So kind of a long-winded answer to that. So.
Thank you, Barney. So there may be other questions, and we are out of time. And just thank you so much for the engagement on this. If you have more comments or questions, you can email Lindsay or Lindy or myself. We will be putting this presentation up on our website, which is on the screen in front of you. We really encourage you to sign up at the site if you want updates on this work, information on how to get involved as we roll toward the fall, and following us on social media, because we are putting a lot of stuff out right now to keep people connected to the work. So I want to thank you for being with us today. I especially want to thank Juanita, Amy, Victoria, Charisse, who am I missing? Alina, for being on the call today and representing the steering committee. And please be in touch. And, this is it's going to take everyone. I think we built a lot of great momentum and we need to keep it going. So we welcome your ideas and thoughts. Enjoy the sunshine, everyone. And thanks again for being here today.